Go, go, go! Don't stop! He's catching up! This way! Move!
Before sunrise in 1852, South Carolina, a plantation woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of panic. By morning, everything had changed, and one name lingered in whispers. Joshua, a field worker who had endured in silence, until loss turned patience into something far more dangerous. The fire was already alive by the time anyone smelled it, moving quietly at first as a faint thread of smoke slipping between wooden boards and drifting across the sleeping plantation in South Carolina in the year 1852, the night air thick with humidity and vibrating with the restless rhythm of cicadas, most people unaware that something irreversible had begun, because fire is patient when it starts and merciless when it finds its voice, and by dawn flames were clawing toward the sky, consuming beams and swallowing stores of cotton, while cracking through structures with a sound like splintering thunder. Men shouting, animals panicking, bells ringing in alarm, yet long before chaos found language, someone had already stepped away into darkness. His name was Joshua, and before that name became an explanation whispered over ash, he was simply another field worker living inside the punishing rhythm dictated by sunrise and heat and exhaustion that settled into the bones before work even began. Rows of cotton stretching farther than sight could rest upon, and labor demanding silence and speed and submission, a world shaped by observation where every movement was watched and every mistake carried weight. Joshua learning early that survival belonged to those who noticed everything. The routes taken by authority, the hours shadows grew longest, the sounds signaling attention or absence, not because he was extraordinary, but because caution itself was protection, and what sustained him beyond the field was not hope in grand form, but fragile connection. Family moments exchanged between labor and darkness. Brief glances, shared reassurances, human anchors that kept despair from spreading too far. Plantation life constantly testing those anchors beneath the surface. Tension that never truly faded. Authority enforcing compliance with severity that left marks beyond skin and into memory. Joshua, understanding this landscape as everyone did, carrying its demands quietly until the day arrived that fractured what he had guarded, and it came without storm or warning, unfolding in ordinary light, making its consequences heavier. Conflict and punishment and separation, the permanence of loss that could not be reversed, absence echoing through memory and reshaping how the world felt beneath his feet. Grief not erupting outwardly, but receding inward until silence became his companion. Those beside him noticing the shift behind his eyes as he continued working, yet seemed distant, as if thought had relocated elsewhere. Grief sharpening perception while dulling warmth. Time stretching and hollowing, observation deepening as land patterns and vulnerabilities imprinted themselves in detail, not rebellion, but pain-seeking direction, because when loss leaves a void, the mind searches for meaning to fill it. Revenge forming slowly in sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Fear existing beside anger and uncertainty. Beside both, acting promising consequences beyond imagination, while inaction promised acceptance of permanence. The balance between these forces shaping him until thought hardened into decision. Preparation appearing unremarkable from the outside. Timing measured, movement subtle. Darkness becoming workspace. Each step leading toward a threshold understood to be irreversible. Crossing it redefining identity not only to others, but to self. The chosen night warm and dense with quiet yet sharpened internally. Memory guiding motion. The first spark small enough to doubt before finding something to feed upon. Hesitation transforming into blaze. Blaze into roar, fire turning autonomy into spectacle as structures representing permanence surrendered to heat and light. The crackle of timber merging with distant shouts as awareness spread and chaos followed in confusion and urgency, emotion colliding with consequence, revealing no simple clarity, only intensity and contradiction, the lived truth that revenge rarely delivers neat resolution. Joshua not remaining to witness aftermath, but stepping into darkness before dawn fully revealed the damage. Search efforts unfolding without certainty. rumors replacing evidence, sightings conflicting, disappearance allowing legend to form where documentation failed, his name carrying different meanings depending on who spoke it, fear or defiance or tragedy or myth. Time continuing forward seasons, returning labor resuming yet imprint remaining within memory. Because stories endure not through event alone, but through what they reveal about human thresholds, pain and loss, and agency, and the limits pushed until something gives way. Joshua existing within that space as reflection of psychology shaped by circumstance. His story resonating not for spectacle, but recognition of a person navigating grief in a world offering little healing and choosing action, ensuring he would never again be invisible. And long after smoke vanished, the image persists of a quiet figure walking into darkness, while flames rose behind him, carrying with them the echo of everything that led him there, and the lingering question retold across time, not only about what he did, but about what it means to reach a point where doing it feels inevitable. In the days that followed his disappearance, the night air no longer smelled of smoke to him, yet its memory clung stubbornly to the back of his throat as he moved through wetlands and thickets where the ground softened underfoot, and the darkness seemed thicker than before. And with each step, Joshua felt the strange collision of freedom and fear pressing against his ribs, because survival outside the boundaries he had always known demanded a different kind of attention, the kind that measured every sound and shadow as possibility or threat, and he found himself listening with the same intensity he once used in the fields. Except now, the sounds were owls shifting on branches, insects vibrating through tall grass, distant water moving slow and unseen, and his body reacted before thought had time to form, shoulders tightening, breath shortening, instinct taking command in ways shaped by years of living under watch. Years that had carved vigilance into him so deeply that he could not separate caution from identity. And when exhaustion eventually forced him to rest beneath a canopy of leaves, he did not sleep fully, but drifted through fragments of awareness where memory and present sensation blurred together. Flashes of voices carried through dreams, faces that were no longer reachable, and the dull ache of absence settling heavier when quiet stretched too long, reminding him that action had not erased grief, but only given it motion, and in those moments alone he felt the complex weight of cultural inheritance carried silently through generations. Fragments of language once spoken by elders, rhythms hummed softly during work, stories passed in coded phrases beneath supervision. And though the plantation sought to define him by labor alone, he carried something older within him, something rooted in resilience and community and survival passed down through people who endured displacement and erasure, yet continued shaping identity through memory and shared understanding. And as he navigated unfamiliar terrain, he drew strength from that invisible lineage, reminding himself that movement itself was an act of preservation, that each decision to continue breathing and adapting formed a quiet declaration of existence. And still the mind does not move in simple lines when trauma lingers. It circles, revisits, questions, and he found himself replaying the final moments before the fire caught hold, examining details as if meaning could be uncovered through repetition, feeling again the heat brushing against skin, hearing again the crack of splitting wood, and with those recollections came the sharp recognition that he had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed, a realization that produced neither triumph nor regret, but something far more layered. An awareness of transformation that unsettled even as it steadied him, because the person who once measured days solely through endurance now carried the knowledge of agency, and agency once discovered does not fade easily. Yet it brings responsibility to confront one's own reflection in altered form. And as hunger began to gnaw at him and practical concerns overtook reflection, he focused on learning the language of landscape, identifying berries he recognized from whispered instruction, locating streams through the coolness of air and the density of plant growth, using patience to avoid drawing notice. And in this process, survival became both physical and psychological discipline, forcing attention outward when inward spirals threatened to consume clarity. And sometimes, while drinking from shallow water, he would catch sight of his own reflection trembling on the surface, and pause long enough to study the unfamiliar expression staring back. The eyes older than he remembered, sharpened by events that compressed years into weeks, and he wondered quietly whether those he left behind would recognize this version of him, or whether identity itself had shifted beyond recall. And yet alongside doubt there existed determination, an understanding that continuing forward honored memory more than surrender ever could. And when loneliness pressed hardest, he revisited internal fragments of community, voices and laughter preserved through recollection, grounding himself in cultural continuity that no boundary could erase. And nights grew easier to endure as routine formed again. A new rhythm built from cautious movement and deliberate rest, the body adapting even while the mind continued negotiating unresolved emotion, and sometimes distant human voices carried faintly across open spaces, reminding him of proximity to structured society and causing instinctive concealment before conscious reasoning engaged. Muscles tightening as trauma responses surfaced, reminders that conditioning does not dissolve with distance. And afterward he would remain still until calm returned, acknowledging without shame that fear remained part of him, that healing rarely unfolds in straight progression, but rather through uneven adjustment. And in those reflective intervals, he examined his motivations not through justification, but through honest recognition of their origin in love and loss and identity, understanding that the act which propelled him into uncertainty had been born from connection rather than destruction alone. That realization allowed a measure of peace to coexist with unresolved complexity, and over time he encountered others moving through similar landscapes. Brief exchanges conducted with caution, yet layered with unspoken comprehension, shared glances carrying recognition of hardship endured under parallel circumstances, cultural signals exchanged quietly, affirming belonging within a broader human tapestry that stretched beyond individual story. And these encounters reminded him that transformation did not isolate completely, but instead repositioned him within evolving networks of resilience. And as seasons shifted subtly, he began to view himself not merely as someone escaping past structures, but as someone actively shaping narrative, understanding that identity continued forming through each decision to trust or withdraw, to reveal or conceal, to remember or reinterpret. And this awareness deepened his introspection, encouraging contemplation of legacy, not in terms of monument but in lived continuity, and sometimes when wind moved through tall grasses, producing a low whispering sound. He allowed himself to imagine futures beyond immediate survival, futures where memory could exist without constant vigilance, and though uncertainty still framed every horizon, he embraced the possibility that transformation could extend beyond reaction into intention, that trauma, though permanent, need not dictate entirety of self, and in acknowledging this, he stepped forward with steadier breath, carrying grief not as weight alone, but as element of identity, interwoven with endurance. The psychological journey ongoing and unfinished, unfolding through each sunrise that found him still moving, still adapting, still human within a world both harsh and expansive enough to contain his story. After that recognition settled into him, the days did not change outwardly, yet his relationship to them transformed in quiet, measurable ways. And Joshua moved through routines with the same physical discipline, but without the emotional presence that once accompanied shared moments, withdrawing into a silence that others sensed, even if they could not name it. His responses shorter, his laughter absent, his gaze lingering longer on distances instead of faces. And those who worked beside him noticed the shift with cautious concern, because communal awareness formed an unspoken language among people accustomed to reading survival cues in one another. Yet no one pressed him openly, since privacy often functioned as respect in a world where vulnerability could not be safely displayed. And within Joshua, that silence became both shield and chamber, protecting fragile thoughts while allowing them space to grow sharper. His mind turning inward, then outward in careful cycles. revisiting memory before redirecting focus toward the structures surrounding him, and gradually observation evolved from passive habit into deliberate study, the plantation revealing itself as layered terrain composed not only of fields, but of rhythms and roots and materials that interacted with human behavior in predictable ways, and he began mapping these patterns subconsciously, noting the angle of morning light across storage buildings, the intervals between patrols, the sounds signaling shifts in supervision, the creak of specific boards under weight, the scent of oil or hay carried on humid air, sensory details embedding themselves into memory through repetition, and this process offered psychological refuge because concentration redirected emotional energy that might otherwise spiral into grief. Yet it also cultivated tension as awareness sharpened toward possibility, and sometimes while standing beneath the sun, his thoughts wandered into hypothetical scenarios, only to retreat quickly under the discipline of caution, his survival instincts reminding him that imagination alone could invite danger if allowed to influence behavior prematurely, and still the ideas returned, persistently shaped by trauma, responses that seek restoration of agency after loss. The human psyche attempting to reclaim equilibrium through envisioning control where control had been stripped away, and Joshua did not yet frame this as intention, but recognized its presence as something waiting beneath consciousness. And evenings found him walking with measured slowness, absorbing the geography surrounding living quarters and workspaces, soil textures shifting beneath his feet, breezes carrying subtle changes in temperature near water or open ground, architecture forming lines of vulnerability or concealment, and through these observations, cultural memory intertwined with immediate environment, teachings inherited through community, emphasizing adaptability and attentiveness, guiding his interpretation of landscape not as confinement alone, but as terrain capable of holding opportunity alongside threat. And this layered perception deepened his internal dialogue as he balanced ethical inheritance with personal motivation, acknowledging reverence for preservation of life while wrestling with impulses born from grief. And occasionally, he caught others watching him with curiosity or unease, sensing the distance in his demeanor, and in response, he maintained composure, aware that external perception could influence consequence, demonstrating outward compliance even while internal transformation progressed, and nights offered further space for contemplation as darkness settled thickly over the land, muffling visual detail yet amplifying sound. Insects thrumming through tall grass, distant movement carrying farther in still air, and he listened intently, training awareness to differentiate between ordinary noise and anomaly. His nervous system attuned through years of conditioning, yet now harnessed deliberately as preparation for undefined future action, and within that, attentive quiet. Memories surfaced unexpectedly, not solely painful recollections, but fragments of cultural identity that reinforced continuity. Songs recalled in rhythm with breathing, stories shared by elders echoing through thought, reminders that identity extended beyond immediate suffering into collective resilience, and this connection grounded him, preventing obsession from narrowing perspective entirely. Yet tension continued building slowly, invisible yet constant, as he considered what might follow if contemplation became action, the uncertainty producing both apprehension and resolve, and over successive days, intention crystallized incrementally through repetition of observation, his awareness of structural vulnerabilities expanding alongside confidence in understanding them, and he found himself pausing at specific points longer than required under pretense of routine, memorizing placement and access without revealing purpose. And this duality between appearance and cognition heightened suspense within him because secrecy demanded vigilance, his senses alert not only to external threat but to internal disclosure, ensuring expression remained neutral while thoughts intensified. And in moments of solitude, he confronted the psychological weight of what formation of intention implied, acknowledging that transformation carried irreversible consequences. Yet he also recognized the depth of change already rooted within him, the fracture from loss altering perception permanently, And this awareness produced as acceptance rather than hesitation, a steady emotional current replacing earlier turmoil. And as time continued, he moved with quiet deliberation, embodying patience. Learned through endurance, understanding that not all responses manifest immediately, and that waiting itself constituted strategy. And thus he carried his silence forward, nurturing observation, refining understanding, allowing intention to mature without declaration, until within the stillness of his own mind, the realization emerged with calm clarity that revenge does not shout, it waits. That realization did not erupt into immediate motion, but settled within him as quiet gravity, shaping each following day until preparation began to take form in ways invisible to those around him, and Joshua carried himself with practiced normalcy, while inside his awareness divided itself between obligation and calculation, his senses cataloging materials and movement and timing as if assembling fragments of an unspoken language. The sun beating down across the fields while his thoughts traced paths between structures, recalling how wood dried beneath prolonged heat, how oil soaked into grain, how wind shifted direction at certain hours, and none of this appeared extraordinary to an observer because attention itself left no footprint. Yet internally, he felt the weight of purpose growing heavier, each observation reinforcing possibility and confronting him with the truth that possibility required choice. And he wrestled with that truth through long afternoons when sweat blurred vision and physical labor masked mental turbulence, his body responding automatically to command, while his mind moved through imagined outcomes, fear rising whenever consequence entered focus, rage surfacing whenever memory returned uninvited. And between these currents he searched for grounding in inherited values carried through culture and community. The teachings that life possessed sacred continuity even under oppression, and the conflict between preservation and retaliation carved deep tension through his thoughts, forcing him to examine whether action could coexist with identity or fracture it further. And often he sought momentary escape in sensory immediacy, focusing on the rough texture of cotton bolls against his fingertips, the smell of soil disturbed by footsteps, the metallic tang of sweat at his lips. Yet inevitably, contemplation resumed because trauma rarely permits sustained distraction, instead guiding cognition toward confrontation with its source. And as days folded into nights, he found himself lingering awake, listening to the distant creak of structures cooling after sunset, the chirring of insects swelling in humid darkness. And during those hours, preparation advanced subtly. His movements measured, steps placed carefully across ground memorized through earlier observation, gathering nothing conspicuous, yet ensuring familiarity with terrain beyond daylight patterns. And this nocturnal awareness heightened physiological responses, heartbeat quickening with each shadow encountered, breath slowing deliberately to avoid sound. Instincts sharpened through years of conditioned caution now redirected toward intentional exploration. And though fear accompanied him, he recognized it not as deterrent but as signal to remain precise, acknowledging its presence while continuing forward, and gradually opportunity aligned with readiness, patterns revealing intervals of reduced attention when activity thinned and structures stood vulnerable beneath moonlight. And he sensed the approach of decision with mounting clarity, understanding that preparation alone sustained tension, but resolution required crossing an internal boundary. And in quiet moments he confronted himself, honestly revisiting memory, not to inflame anger, but to evaluate motivation, examining whether what guided him arose solely from pain or from deeper assertion of identity shaped by cultural inheritance that refused erasure. And through that introspection he discerned complexity rather than simplicity, grief interwoven with longing for acknowledgement of humanity. And this recognition neither absolved nor condemned his intention, yet granted him ownership of it, allowing agency to emerge without illusion. And still, hesitation lingered, surfacing in sudden recollections of shared laughter and community warmth, reminders of interconnectedness that rendered potential consequences heavier. And he paced internally between those recollections and the persistent echo of loss until equilibrium shifted and determination solidified, not through emotional eruption, but through sober acceptance, that his path had diverged irreversibly from passive endurance. And once that acceptance rooted itself, preparation accelerated. His senses attuned to the rhythm of approaching opportunity. Evenings spent aligning awareness with environment, fingertips grazing surfaces that would later shape outcome, nostrils identifying scents carried through darkness, ears mapping distance through layered sound, and in this heightened state, perception expanded, every sensation vivid and instructive, and his body responded accordingly. Muscles coiled with anticipation, yet restrained by discipline. And as the appointed evening drew near, his internal dialogue quieted, replaced by focused clarity. Fear, acknowledged yet contained. Rage transmuted into controlled intention, and when twilight descended, he moved through routine gestures without deviation, aware that observation from others remained possible, maintaining composure until night fully settled and communal spaces dimmed, and then he began. Steps slow and deliberate, the ground cool beneath his feet, air heavy with the scent of vegetation and distant water, stars faint through drifting haze, and each motion felt magnified by awareness of consequence. His senses stretching outward and inward, simultaneously monitoring environment and emotion. And while navigating familiar paths, he reflected briefly on the journey from silence to this threshold. Recognizing transformation not as single moment, but accumulation of countless thoughts and sensations that reshaped identity gradually. And this reflection did not halt him because motivation had matured beyond impulsive reaction into conscious choice. And upon reaching his destination, he paused, allowing stillness to settle, palms resting against surfaces whose textures he knew intimately, feeling the subtle vibration of nightlife around him, grounding himself through tactile connection to reality before proceeding, and in that pause, the full weight of stakes revealed itself. Knowledge that outcome would alter not only physical surroundings, but internal landscape permanently. And he accepted that weight with solemn resolve, drawing breath measured and steady, and as he acted, time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously, details sharpening into clarity, the faint rasp of movement, the smell of treated wood, the flicker of light responding to intention, and within those seconds his mind balanced opposing impulses, the instinct to retreat colliding with commitment to continue, and he crossed that threshold without spectacle, simply by refusing to stop, and once action began, it unfolded with autonomy beyond reconsideration, and he remained only long enough to ensure momentum, witnessing transformation ignite yet feeling no triumph, only intensity and release intertwined. And then he withdrew, retracing steps guided by memory and darkness, senses heightened further by distant disturbance beginning to stir behind him, and as he moved away his internal state shifted subtly from anticipation to reflection, acknowledging completion without fully comprehending ramifications. And he traveled through night accompanied by steady rhythm within his chest, marking passage from preparation to consequence. And though uncertainty stretched ahead, he recognized irrevocable change had occurred within and without, and beneath the vast canopy of sky, he allowed himself one final still moment, absorbing the gravity of transition before continuing onward, because then the night arrived. And the darkness did not remain silent for long, because what began as contained motion transformed into living force, and Joshua felt it before he fully saw it. The subtle shift of air warming against his skin, the faint crackle rising behind him like distant branches snapping, and when he turned just enough to confirm it, his eyes caught the first bloom of orange pushing against shadow, small at first, yet alive with intention. And he held himself still for a breath that seemed suspended outside of time, watching as the light gathered confidence, spreading along surfaces he knew intimately, tracing edges and corners with restless hunger. And though distance separated him from its center, he sensed the heat expanding outward, felt the atmosphere altering in response, and within that awareness, something inside him responded with equal intensity, not satisfaction, but recognition of consequence, unfolding in real time. And he continued moving away. Yet the sounds followed, growing from whispers into sharper reports as materials responded under strain. And across the plantation, the ordinary, quiet, fractured into confusion, voices rising unevenly, footsteps scattering, the disruption of order cascading outward with accelerating urgency, and Joshua paused again at a vantage where he could observe without being seen, compelled not by curiosity alone, but by psychological need to confront what had been set in motion. And as flames climbed higher, they painted structures in erratic light, transforming familiar silhouettes into wavering shapes that seemed both tangible and symbolic. And he watched beams darken, then glow, then collapse inward, each transformation accompanied by noise that reverberated through his chest, and his emotional state moved through currents difficult to separate, grief resurfacing as memory layered itself over spectacle, anger echoing in tandem with release. And beneath both a steady undercurrent of complexity, reminding him that destruction does not simplify feeling but multiplies it, and he found himself recalling faces and voices carried through memory, while witnessing the dismantling of physical authority around him, and this convergence produced catharsis laced with sorrow, a recognition that no act could restore what absence had taken, yet acknowledgement that silence had not been his only language, and as the blaze intensified, panic spread among those attempting response, silhouettes moving rapidly, shouts overlapping without coordination, tools raised against force too large to control easily, and the scent of burning timber thickened the air, drifting outward until it reached him with unmistakable sharpness, filling lungs with acrid texture that provoked reflexive tension, and he turned slightly to shield his breathing while still observing, body responding automatically to sensory overload, heart striking a faster rhythm not solely from exertion, but from neurological echo of confrontation with trauma and consequence intertwined, and his thoughts drifted toward cultural memory once more, considering how ancestral endurance had carried both suffering and adaptation, how identity survived through navigation of upheaval rather than avoidance of it. And he recognized himself now as participant within that continuum, neither detached observer nor singular anomaly, but individual shaped by history and circumstance, acting within limited framework of agency. And this perspective grounded him briefly amid intensity, allowing him to maintain composure as events accelerated and flames spread further, claiming additional structures. Light flickering violently against the night sky, and he felt a surge of conflicting impulses urging departure and observation simultaneously. The instinct for self-preservation advising distance, while emotional need for witnessing anchored him momentarily, and eventually survival instinct prevailed, guiding him deeper into shadow where visibility diminished. And as he retreated, he could still hear the unfolding chaos behind him. Wood collapsing, voices carrying alarm, animals stirring in agitation, and these sounds accompanied his movement like echoing reminders of irreversible transformation. And internally, he confronted the moral dimension of what he had enacted, not through denial or dramatization, but through honest acknowledgement that consequence extended beyond symbolic target into wider ripple affecting many lives. And this recognition did not dismantle his motivation, yet required him to accept layered responsibility, an acceptance shaped by maturity rather than impulse. And he walked onward, holding that awareness alongside lingering catharsis, understanding that identity is rarely defined by single act, but inevitably altered by it. And as distance increased, the brightness softened yet remained visible on horizon, casting glow that illuminated treetops and scattered cloud edges, and he slowed eventually, allowing himself to rest briefly beneath sheltering branches, lungs drawing cooler air while ears still caught faint traces of commotion far behind, and in that quieter space, introspection deepened further, examining transformation not solely through event, but through emotional evolution leading to it, acknowledging how grief had reshaped perception and how action had reshaped self-understanding, and he felt neither triumph nor despair. Dominating only layered awareness of complexity inherent in human response to injustice and loss. And after gathering strength, he resumed movement, guided by necessity to place greater distance between himself and origin of upheaval, navigating through darkness that felt both protective and isolating, and as time passed and sound diminished, he sensed transition from climax into aftermath, his body calming gradually, while mind remained alert, replaying sensory impressions in vivid detail, processing shock and release through reflection that would continue long beyond that night. And somewhere behind him, smoke thickened, then thinned as flames exhausted their fuel, and though he could no longer see the blaze, he carried its image within memory, symbolic and tangible intertwined, and he knew instinctively that action had not concluded narrative, but redirected it entirely. And as the air cleared around him and horizon returned to deeper black, he accepted with quiet gravity that revenge never ends with the act itself. The hours that followed unfolded without ceremony and without witness beyond the land itself. And as Joshua moved farther from the glow that had once dominated the horizon, the air cooled against his skin and carried only faint residue of smoke. Yet the memory of it lingered within him as sensation rather than image, settling into breath and pulse and thought. And somewhere behind him, the plantation shifted from chaos into aftermath. Structures reduced to skeletal outlines against dim light, timbers blackened and twisted, ash drifting through early morning currents that smelled of char and damp soil, and those who remained behind walked through ruin, measuring loss with stunned silence punctuated by urgent speculation, their voices searching for explanation in fragments of observation, and already the first threads of narrative began weaving themselves around a name spoken with uncertainty and intensity, while Joshua himself pressed onward, guided by survival instincts refined through necessity, his body alert to terrain, muscles aching yet steady, his hearing tuned to the smallest disruption. Because distance did not erase danger, it only altered its form, and as dawn approached, he found temporary concealment beneath dense growth where filtered light broke through leaves in fractured patterns. And there he rested with caution, closing his eyes without surrendering awareness, and in that liminal state between exhaustion and vigilance, his internal landscape expanded with reflection, emotions surfacing in overlapping layers that resisted simple definition, the catharsis of action now tempered by sobering recognition of permanence. And he revisited motivation not to justify or condemn, but to understand himself within unfolding narrative, recognizing how trauma responses had guided him toward reclaiming agency, how cultural identity had sustained resilience through contemplation, and how transformation had altered his perception of possibility itself. And he accepted that no return awaited him, that the life preceding the fire existed only as memory carried forward rather than destination regained. And this acknowledgement grounded him within present reality, forcing practical thought to dominate once more, hunger asserting itself, thirst drawing attention toward nearby water. And he resumed movement when light strengthened, navigating carefully along shaded routes where visibility from distance remained limited, and as he traveled, his senses absorbed unfamiliar textures and scents, wild vegetation brushing against skin, insects stirring from hidden places, the quiet rhythm of streams offering reassurance that environment could provide as well as conceal. And within this sensory immersion, he discovered moments of unexpected calm, where identity felt less defined by past and more shaped by immediate existence. Yet memory returned persistently, not always as pain, but as anchor, reminding him of origin and continuity, and he carried those recollections, respectfully acknowledging that cultural lineage accompanied him wherever he stepped, guiding decisions and affirming belonging within collective endurance beyond singular story. And behind him, the plantation's narrative continued evolving without his presence, search efforts expanding across surrounding land, driven by urgency and fear. Mounted figures traversing fields and roads, questions asked and answered incompletely, and reports conflicting in detail as human recollection filtered experience through emotion, some insisting they glimpsed movement near the blaze, others denying certainty, and over time, the absence of resolution allowed imagination to fill voids where evidence could not reach. transforming event into speculation layered with interpretation, and Joshua remained unaware of specific words spoken, yet understood instinctively that pursuit existed, his trauma responses maintaining vigilance whenever distant sound approached or unfamiliar pattern appeared. And occasionally, he adjusted course abruptly, guided by intuition alone, trusting senses sharpened through conditioning, and these adjustments revealed adaptability grown from hardship. His survival instincts no longer reactive alone, but proactive, shaping navigation toward sustainability. And during solitary pauses, he contemplated his own future with honesty, acknowledging uncertainty without surrendering hope, recognizing that identity could continue evolving independent of environment that once constrained it. And he examined the myth already forming beyond his awareness, considering how stories simplify individuals into symbols. And though he could not control narrative, he resolved internally to preserve authenticity within himself, refusing reduction to legend alone, and thus he moved forward embracing ambiguity as companion rather than adversary, accepting that disappearance did not equal erasure, but transition into different chapter of existence, and nights and days blended gradually into new rhythm, defined by movement and reflection, and with each passing interval, emotional equilibrium stabilized further, grief integrating into identity rather than dominating it, agency existing alongside humility. And he discovered that transformation had not severed his connection to humanity, but deepened empathy for complexity within others and himself, and somewhere behind him, tales expanded, retold through varying perspectives, painting him alternately as specter or symbol or cautionary memory. Yet he walked beyond those interpretations, grounded in lived experience that defied simplification, and as distance widened, his thoughts shifted toward broader understanding of place within a continuum of similar stories across time, recognizing that his journey reflected patterns repeated by many, navigating injustice and survival, and this awareness broadened perspective, lending purpose to endurance beyond personal narrative. And beneath vast sky, he allowed himself quiet acknowledgement of belonging within something larger than singular act or moment. And as he continued onward, neither fully hidden nor fully defined, he carried forward with steady breath and open awareness into landscape that offered both uncertainty and possibility, while behind him myth and memory intertwined among those recounting events through their own lenses, and thus reflection settled over his path and ambiguity shaped perception until story itself transcended origin, and the voice of history seemed to widen around him, whispering that stories like Joshua's didn't end in flames. The landscape shifted gradually with the passage of years. The physical traces of fire long vanished, yet the memory of what occurred persisted in ways both subtle and profound, and Joshua's presence, whether remembered accurately or mythologized, became part of a tapestry connecting resistance across generations, because human survival under oppression is rarely linear, rarely visible in public record alone. It exists in patterns of thought and behavior, in quiet assertion of self, in adaptation and foresight. And he carried that understanding forward even when movement took him through spaces that seemed indifferent. Forests thick with undergrowth, whispering as wind brushed leaves together, streams running clear and unhurried, while rocks scattered sound in irregular rhythm. The air scented faintly of pine resin and earth, a sensory backdrop grounding him while mind moved through reflection on what had been and what could never be undone. And in solitude, he considered the psychology of endurance, how grief and rage could become tools without consuming identity, how trauma imprints yet need not define, how cultural memory offered both compass and anchor, guiding ethical action while validating emotion. And he understood that stories of resistance functioned similarly, not as tales of spectacle, but as frameworks for navigating survival, narratives that carried caution, creativity, and assertion across time. And Joshua's own story began to occupy that space within his mind, less about flames and more about persistence, about the will to assert humanity within a structure intent on denying it, and he felt weight in knowing that legacy could exist without observation, that influence traveled invisibly through behavior and reflection, teaching others who might never know him personally. The possibility of endurance, the capacity for agency, the courage to act within moral complexity, and in this contemplation he revisited internal landscapes shaped by prior events, examining thoughts that had guided him through fear and rage, moments when instinct had balanced impulse, the rapid calculation of danger and opportunity in darkness, the way decision itself transformed perception, and through this introspection, he recognized transformation not as isolated incident, but as continuous process, one shaped by circumstances, culture, memory, and deliberate attention, and he felt how resilience could coexist with sorrow, how identity could accommodate both grief and assertion without collapsing, how survival involved subtle victories as well as overt actions, and the tactile world around him reinforced these lessons. Soil pressed against his palms as he prepared makeshift shelters, leaves rustling softly as he moved silently, water flowing over stones in rhythm, both calming and instructive, sounds and textures acting as constant cues for presence and reflection, and while navigating these spaces, he acknowledged the duality of legacy, the part visible through stories told and retold and the part entirely private, yet no less impactful, how influence extends through memory and example, rather than record alone, and, in understanding this, he allowed himself to feel connection not only to ancestors who endured before him, but to those who would come after. The continuity of identity across oppression, the subtle assertion that human resilience persists even when power seeks to erase it, and he considered the moral dimensions of his own action, the complexity of intent and consequence intertwined, recognizing that revenge had not simplified the world but altered it in layered ways, creating both liberation and loss. And this awareness sharpened perception, instilling both humility and clarity about the weight carried when asserting self within systems designed to dominate, and sensory engagement continued to anchor him. The cool of stream water against wrist, the rough bark of trees pressed to shoulder, the distant cries of birds punctuating quiet, all grounding him in physical reality, while reflection unfolded and thought returned often to memory of those left behind. The absence, the faces and voices that had shaped daily rhythm before fracture, the longing that had driven first action, and in these recollections he did not find regret but recognition, an understanding that transformation often demands passage through extremes of emotion, that courage and grief coexist, that identity is continually negotiated through circumstance and choice, and as days became weeks and weeks became months, he observed how landscapes and communities themselves carry memory, how others' stories intersect with his own in unspoken ways, patterns of endurance emerging in shared practice, in whispered instruction, in subtle assertion of autonomy, and he recognized that history is layered, memory and myth entangling, individual action, amplifying through social consciousness, how one's journey becomes lens through which others interpret survival and resistance. And within this understanding, he cultivated steadiness, a psychological equilibrium allowing reflection without stagnation, grief without collapse, agency without arrogance. And through that balance, he saw clearly the teaching embedded in stories like his, that remembrance functions both to honor past and guide future, that human resilience is an inheritance transmitted across time, that identity is preserved in both what is acted and what is internalized, and sensory engagement remained inseparable from thought. Leaves underfoot reminding of presence, wine carrying distant sense of flora, water murmuring continuity even in isolation, all supporting mental acuity necessary to navigate further. And he considered the effect of observation upon others, how those who witnessed his actions or heard fragments interpreted meaning differently, how legend forms at intersection of fact and imagination, how narrative carries ethical and psychological weight. Independent of intent, and within that framework, he reconciled tension between public perception and personal truth, acknowledging both as valid components of legacy and he felt the enduring pulse of cultural continuity. Knowledge embedded in song, gesture, rhythm, lesson, each guiding principle reinforcing awareness that memory itself is act of survival, consciousness of self intertwined with consciousness of lineage. And as reflection deepened, he saw clearly how agency exercised under oppression can transform not only material circumstance, but internal landscape. How deliberate movement, whether through labor, concealment, or action, shapes perception and identity across time. And this awareness expanded to include future possibilities, how action resonates outward in complex patterns, teaching those who follow even in absence of direct witness, shaping understanding of ethical navigation, courage, and consequence. And he observed how myth and memory intersect to form symbolic guidance, where story informs survival while grounding ethical understanding, and he allowed imagination to dwell on these intersections without anxiety, embracing ambiguity inherent in legacy. And in this embrace, he felt quiet pride in resilience transmitted through memory and action, in capacity to endure without surrendering humanity, in ability to act within moral complexity and carry forward learning embedded in consequence, and sensory detail continued as companion to reflection, tactile, auditory, olfactory cues, reinforcing perception and presence, grounding abstract thought in concrete environment. And as he moved through days, he integrated these lessons seamlessly with daily rhythm. Practice guiding perception, perception informing reflection, reflection informing choice. And within this continuum, he discovered psychological stability grounded in layered understanding of self, culture, and human endurance. A stability marked not by absence of tension, but by management of it, and awareness of moral and emotional dimensions of action, presence within environment, responsiveness to inherited knowledge, and attentiveness to consequence and opportunity. And as he rested beneath twilight filtering through trees, watching shadows lengthen and contract, listening to subtle currents of wind and water, feeling earth beneath body and pulse of life around, he understood fully the weight and beauty of stories carried forward, of resistance remembered, of survival enacted through observation and choice. And he reflected on how narrative itself functions as living presence, shaping those who know it and those who never will, bridging absence and action, past and future, grief and endurance. And as night fell with quiet inevitability, he allowed himself one final consideration, that some fires fade, but some leave marks history never erases. Welcome to Echoes of Revenge, where we uncover the untold stories of courage, defiance, and justice that history tried to erase. If you want to witness the raw truth behind acts of resistance and feel the intensity of every story as if you were there, hit that subscribe button now and join our journey into the shadows of history. Don't just watch, experience it, remember it, and never let these voices fade.